Hello and welcome, Woodrow Wilson friends, family, and students. This is Miss Fields here, and I'm joining you tonight for our 15th episode of Math Toolbox. Tonight we're going to be building on the previous instructional video, which was on comparing and ordering fractions. And we're going to be transferring this skill to apply it to adding and subtracting fractions. Just as in every other problem that we do in 5th grade, this skill is going to need to be embedded in some kind of word problem context. It's very rare in 5th grade that we'll ever expect you to just add or subtract fractions with the numbers themselves. We want to make sure the math is meaningful and that there's actually some kind of context to kind of show that math is relevant to every part of life, whether it's adding jars of pickles like today or it's calculating your rent. Math is part of life. So let's look at the problem that we're trying to figure out today. It says Miss Fields has 4/5 of a jar of pickles. Mrs. Nichols has 2/3 of a jar of pickles. How much of a jar of pickles do they have in total? So two things are coming to my mind immediately as I'm looking at this word problem. I'm thinking I need to analyze this problem to figure out what kind of operation I'm going to be using. And also I need to start to organize my work. So if I had a notebook with me right now, I would be drawing a foursquare to organize my work. And in the top left corner of that foursquare, I would be writing UKT. And it would look something like this. Right now, I just have the two fractions relevant to our word problem, 4/5 of my jar of pickles and 2/3 of Miss Nichols' jar of pickles. However, I don't know whether I'm adding or subtracting yet. And that's where UKT comes in. First step, I'm going to be looking at the fractions. Right after them, I'm going to be seeing if there's a unit associated with them. So in this first part of the word problem, I'm seeing that I have 4/5 of a jar of pickles. So that fraction is associated with a jar of pickles. I only have 4/5 of one. And then I'm looking at Miss Nichols, and she has 2/3 of a jar of pickles. So in our top left part of our UKT, you're writing down your units. I would be writing down jars of pickles and jars of pickles because these are the units associated with each of these fractions. One thing that's going on in my mind right now is that I'm seeing that the units are matching. And my background knowledge tells me that if the units are matching, then there is a highly likely possibility that we will be adding or subtracting. However, in order to confirm that, we're going to need to look at the keywords and potentially the total, seeing if we need to find it or if we already know it. Next up, I'm looking at keywords. As I'm scanning through, I'm seeing that in total is one of the key words that I learned in the past. Now putting it all together, matching units, which is adding or subtracting, and then total as our keyword, my background knowledge tells me that we are going to be adding. Now this will not always be the instance if you have matching units and then it says in total. However, it's highly likely that you will be adding if these two things match. Now to double check, you need to look back in the context of the word problem, and it's asking how much of a jar of pickles do these two ladies have in total, meaning that we want to see all of the jars of pickles. We're not comparing. If we were comparing the two, then we would be subtracting, but we're trying to find out how much there are all in total, and that implies that we will be adding. Now our next step in adding fractions is we need to identify the denominator. Now, if you don't remember from our previous video, the denominator is the number on the bottom, and this dictates how many parts there are in the whole. Now, for my fraction, I have 4 out of 5 parts of the whole. In Miss Nichols' fraction, she has 2 out of 3 parts of the whole. Moving over here to our foursquare, we need to find a common denominator, because whenever you're adding fractions, it's impossible to be able to add two fractions with unlike denominators because they're not comparable. It's like comparing apples to oranges. You just can't do it. So what we need to do is we need to list off common multiples. Now, if you don't know your multiples of 5 or if you don't know your multiples of 3, look at a multiplication chart, look up one online, print one out, and you can list them from there. For me, it's easy because I've memorized my multiples, so I'm going to count up at least 5 different multiples of 5. 5, 10, 15, 20, 25. I'll stop there. Over to 3, I'm going to list off at least 5, and if I don't have a match, I'm going to continue. 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 18, 24, 27. In looking for matches, I'm seeing that we have a match here with our 15s. So that is going to be our common denominator, or least common multiple between these two numbers. Now here comes the hardest part. We need to make an equivalent fraction with these two denominators, 15, in order to add these together appropriately. So, since this is the hardest thing for 5th graders to do this year, I make sure I start off by making my work organized. So I write down my two original fractions. We've got 4/5 and 2/3. And I put multiplication signs on both the denominator and the numerator on both fractions to indicate to myself that whatever I multiply my denominator by, I also have to multiply my numerator by. And the reason why we do this is because it makes sure that we have an equivalent fraction. Because we're not trying to change the value of the fraction, we just want to make sure that that fraction has a denominator of 15. Next step is we need to use a little bit of algebra to figure out what number to multiply this 5 by and what number to multiply this 3 by in order to get a denominator of 15. That being said, if you struggle with this algebraic concept of guessing the missing number, use your resources. So starting with our denominator of 5, I'm going to look up here. I don't know what 5 times something equals 15, so I'm going to count up my multiples. 1, 2, 3. I can see that 3 groups of 5 make 15. So that's what I'm going to multiply my bottom and my top by. 5 times 3 is 15, and I know that 4 times 3 is 12. Same down here. If I don't know how to algebraically figure out what times 3 is 15, I can look up here and count my multiples. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I see that 5 groups of 3 equal 15, so I'm going to multiply my denominator by 5 and my numerator by 5. 3 times 5 is 15. 2 times 5 is 10. 12/15 is equivalent to 4/5, and 10/15 is equivalent to 2/3. Now we can add or subtract these fractions with no problem. Coming over here to the solve and state solution section, I know that when I'm adding fractions, my denominator stays exactly the same. So over here on my fraction that I know is going to be the sum or the answer to our addition problem, I'm putting 15 immediately so I don't get confused. However, I know in my head that I'm going to be adding these two numerators. And I know 12 plus 10 is 22. So the sum of these two fractions is 22/15. Now, in 5th grade, the expectation is if the numerator is bigger than the denominator, then you have a fraction greater than 1, which implies that you're going to need to make a mixed number. How do we make a mixed number? Well, we know every fraction is a division problem, where you divide the top by the bottom. In order to simplify that fraction greater than 1, we are going to divide 22 by 15. Now, in thinking about the steps to a division problem, we've got 4. You start by dividing, multiplying, subtracting, and bringing down. Looking at our first digit, how many groups of 15 can we take away from 2? We know 0 groups of 15 can be taken away from 2 because that would give us a negative number. Now, looking at this 22 as a whole, how many groups of 15 can we take away from 22? I know at least 1 group of 15 can be taken away from 22. Now, if I were to put 2 up here, that would give me 30, and I cannot subtract 30 from 22. That would give me a negative number. Next step is multiply. 15 times 1 is 15. Next step is subtract. Now, I see that I can't subtract 5 from 2, so I know I need to regroup. I need to change this 20 into a 10. That's what the 1 is. And then I need to bring those 10s over to this 2, and that gives me 12. So our new subtraction problem is 12 minus 5. 12 minus 5 is 7, which is our remainder. Now this is the trickiest part of creating a mixed number from a fraction greater than 1. You've got your remainder here, and you've got your divisor here. Now you make your fraction part of your mixed number by making sure that the divisor is your denominator, because that's the number that you're dividing by. And then your remainder is your numerator, because that is the fraction that you have left. Going back to the original problem, What are we trying to solve? How much of a jar of pickles do we have in total? On the previous slide, we saw that we have 1 7/15 jars of pickles, and so that's what we would state. Miss Fields and Mrs. Nichols have 1 7/15 jars of pickles. Now again, this is a skill that builds on comparing and ordering fractions. The hardest thing about this skill is finding common denominators and from then making equivalent fractions. If this is something that's a struggle for you, continue to practice because practice makes permanent. Go back and review the other instructional videos, and I can't wait to practice with you tomorrow. Have a great night.